Good morning and Happy New Year. Thank you everybody for jumping on our webinar today. It's about 10:02. A couple more minutes. It looks like we have a few more people signing on. So I'm going to give it a couple more minutes as people jump onto the webinar and we'll get started shortly. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm being told that there's a little bit of a delay in my internet, so I apologize if that's a little annoying. I will try to call in once we kick it over to Megan. But thank you. Yes, this is our very first webinar of 2021. Today's a pretty hot topic. You know, as we roll into vaccinations throughout our workforces and just in our personal lives, there are a lot of questions, you know, kind of popping up as what we need to do as employers to help protect our staff, what we you know, can do in you know, kind of coordinating vaccinations or maybe even making them mandatory. So today we have Megan Balne with she's an employment law attorney and partner at Hyland Levin Shapiro today. Just a few housekeeping items before I kick it over to Megan. If you have any questions, please feel free to type that into the chat box. We are happy to throw those out there to Megan and have her answer some of those questions for you if she's capable of doing so. We like to keep this a little interactive, so please feel free to share that information. If you have questions that may be a little bit more detailed and you want to email those directly to me, that's fine as well. I can certainly share those with Megan after our presentation today. I did want to share, you see that we have our our next KP HR workshop coming up first. And that's going to be, you know, really around some changes that are coming down the pipeline with the new administration and what we can possibly see in the future. So that's going to be provided by Amy McAndrews through Mid-Atlantic Employers Association. Those of you that have joined our KP workshops in the past are pretty familiar with Amy and know that she does a pretty good job. So with that being said, I'm just going to go ahead and switch over to Megan as our presenter.
Good morning, everyone. I am just going to start sharing my screen, and Chrissy, help me out just to make sure that everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation here.
Looks good.
All right, great. So Welcome everyone. Chrissy, thanks very much for asking me here today. I'm looking forward to talking to you. I like to keep things interactive, so please don't hesitate to throw your questions in the chat. I know we're virtual and that can be a little bit boring, to say the least. So please, let's have a dialogue. Definitely be talking to me throughout this presentation, and hopefully I can answer your questions, because the idea of the COVID-19 vaccine and different policies, that is the hot topic. I'm sure your emails have been inundated with information. It may be hard to process, and I think the best way to sort of talk through these issues is to talk through them. So please put your questions in the chat. So
Megan, real quick before you get started.
Oh, what was that?
Real quick before you get started, I'm just going to have you minimize your toolbar to the right. Just hit that orange arrow.
Oh, got it. Thanks. Okay. Hold on. We'll get there.
Perfect.
Okay. So can you see the presentation?
Yep. Looks good.
Perfect. Okay, great. Okay. So the first place to start with COVID-19 vaccine policies is your legal framework. And here is just a bullet point of the laws that are in play here. Now, the COVID-19 vaccine is obviously brand new, but that doesn't mean all of the legal concepts around it are brand new. So it's important to keep in mind everything you already know about the ADA, Title VII, OSHA. Those things are continuing to come into play here. What we have as well, which is the first bullet point, is the EUA, which is the Emergency Use Act. The COVID-19 vaccine is still considered experimental. It was authorized for use under the EUA. Consequently, you can't treat the COVID-19 vaccine like you would treat a flu vaccine for that regard, okay? Because it's still considered experimental. And in the EUA, there's actually a requirement that there needs to be an appropriate means for individuals to refuse the vaccine. So right there, you need to know that you can't have a mandatory COVID-19 vaccine at this moment in time. Right now, Pfizer has said that they are looking for full FDA approval. They're going to hopefully file it in April of 2021. So at minimum, between now and April, you've got the EUA here that says this vaccine's experimental. Because it's experimental, you need to have an appropriate method for individuals to opt out of it. So that's very important just to keep in mind as we're talking about this framework. However, this opt-out requirement only exists until the vaccine is fully approved by the FDA. And once you have a vaccine that's fully approved by the FDA, that goes away. So like everything with COVID, a vaccine policy needs to be fluid, and you need to continually evaluate, are you doing what you need to do for your business? Are you making the right choice on a policy given the legal framework at the time? Because these things are constantly changing. But as of this moment, you can't have a mandatory vaccine policy because you need to have this appropriate way for individuals to refuse it. The other act that's in play is OSHA. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a following slide. But there's this obligation, right, for the employer to maintain a safe work environment that you need to constantly keep in mind. There's the ADA, okay, Americans with Disabilities Act. That's where you get your medical exemptions to the vaccine. And then you've got Title VII. And Title VII is your religious exemption to the vaccine. So let's look at these, a little more in depth. Let's talk about OSHA. So right now under OSHA, there is no requirement to mandate the vaccine. So OSHA guidance has not come out and said mandatory vaccine policies are necessary to ensure a safe workplace. That's not what they're saying. So there's no obligation here to have a mandatory vaccine policy. However, employers are encouraged to inform their employees of the benefits of vaccinations. So what OSHA, guidance is saying here is that vaccines, even the experimental vaccines that are being rolled out right now, are beneficial, and employers should inform their employees of the benefits of vaccines as it gets rolled out. And you need to provide, obviously, exceptions for medical conditions. So as right now, with the vaccine being in an experimental state, there's no mandate here. But again, as we go through the rounds of approval, and if it becomes approved by the FDA, you could have a change to this guidance as the vaccine becomes safer and more recognized by the FDA, and it's not under this EUA law. So keep following that. And what does it mean to properly inform your employees of the benefits of vaccinations? You have to keep up to date with what's going on. Look at the CDC, for guidance as well, for posters, literature, things that you can give your employees that talk about the benefits of the vaccine for the workplace, for an individual's own health. Make sure that you're just staying on top of the guidance on what you need to say there. ADA, this is the big one I think that everybody is talking about, which is if you do have a vaccine policy as an employer and you're encouraging your employees to get the vaccine, you're talking to your employees about the benefits to the vaccine, what does the ADA provide? So the ADA provides a basis for individuals with medical disabilities to request a reasonable accommodation. So this is not new, and this is why I think it's always important as an employer, even though we're dealing with novel issues like a brand new vaccine that came out, the analysis and how you treat it is not new. So whenever you have an employee with a disability, that employee is entitled to a reasonable accommodation unless that accommodation would present an undue hardship. The same analysis that you would go through as an employer for an employee with a disability for any other policy is the same analysis that you would undertake with a COVID-19 vaccine policy. And remember, undue hardship for an employer is a very high standard to meet. So what happens when you have an employee, you're putting out your vaccine policy, and your vaccine policy is let's encourage our employees to get the vaccine, and you have an employee that says I absolutely cannot get the vaccine because I have a medical condition. So what do you do in that scenario? You have to look at, well, is there a reasonable accommodation for this employee? And it's very fact specific. So you need to look at what job does the employee have? Could the employee use an alternative means instead of getting the vaccine, like PPE, mask wearing, hand sanitizing? Could the employee be a remote worker? Are there accommodations that could help the employee? And then if there are no accommodations that could help the employee, is there actually an undue hardship to the employer if this employee does not get vaccinated? So right now, COVID-19 has previously been found to pose a significant risk of substantial harm in the workplace. So if you have an employee that is not vaccinated and they're coming into contact with members of the public, could there be an undue hardship? Maybe, okay, based on how, COVID-19 has been classified from March 2020 to now. I think depending on who the employer is, what work the employer does, and what level of interaction the employee has with other employees or the public, I think there could possibly be a finding of undue hardship that the employer can say, listen, we need you to get this vaccine and we can't accommodate you. So that is definitely an option here, but you need to go through that process to talk with the employee, and you need to treat an exemption to COVID-19 like you would treat any other disability analysis under the ADA. So that's important. Okay, Title VII. This is your legal framework for sincerely held religious beliefs. Now, the question I tend to get a lot is, how do I know if my employee has a sincerely held religious belief? What type of documentation should I ask for my employee who says they have a sincerely held religious belief? And my best practices is don't engage in that analysis. It is incredibly subjective and fact specific to engage in a sincerely held religious belief analysis. So don't do it. Just take the employee for their word that they have a sincerely held religious belief and jump right into your accommodation analysis, because that is the easier, more objective, and litigation proof analysis that you can do. So if you have an employee that comes to you and says, I have a sincerely held religious belief and I don't want this vaccine, take them at their word, have them document it, obviously, and then say, okay, we're going to go into this analysis to determine if we can give you an accommodation, and treat it like you would treat any other interactive dialogue in terms of what is the accommodation requested, and can you provide the accommodation unless it imposes, a more than minimal cost. So in here, the standard of could you, grant an accommodation, it's different than the ADA, okay? The guidance is that the standard for undue hardship under the ADA for an employer is higher than under Title VII. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that if you have an employee that's requesting an exemption for a medical reason under the ADA, it's going to be harder for the employer to say no to the employee with the medical exemption than it is for the employer to say no under Title VII for the religious belief, because under Title VII, it's an easier standard for the employer to meet to say that they could not provide an accommodation. This standard under Title VII is, unless the accommodation imposes a more than minimal cost, you're required to do it. So it's a cost analysis, and the cost analysis can be both economic and non-economic. Okay, so when you talk economic cost, you're talking dollars and cents. Okay, when you're talking non-economic cost, you're talking about general workplace safety. It could be, if you're a retail business, and you have someone that's not vaccinated, it could be potential harm to the public. It can be other costs that are not what we call dollars and cents cost. So that's why, I'm telling you, don't go down the rabbit hole of is a belief sincerely religious and sincerely held by the employee. Don't go down that rabbit hole. No good can come from it. Focus your energy on the accommodation analysis. What's been interesting is, again, while COVID-19 is a new vaccine, we do have guidance out there from the flu vaccine and other vaccines from the Third Circuit. So there's a really great case that came out in the Third Circuit in 2017. So when I, as a lawyer, am looking at cases, the first thing that I look at is, where is the case coming out of? The Third Circuit is New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. So those states are certainly in the area that we are talking about. It would be very what we call precedent or binding, on those three states. So that's good. And then I look at the year, 2017, that's pretty recent for a case to come out. So I'm thinking, okay, these principles that are in this case are good law. They were recently applied. They're principles that I can rely on when I'm looking at a new issue that might not be exactly the same, but is close. So what is this case? This case is Fallon versus Mercy Catholic Medical Center. And it's a hospital. And this hospital was requiring vaccinations for its employee for flu shots. And a hospital worker refused to get the flu shot and said that they had a sincerely held religious belief. And because they had this sincerely held religious belief, they didn't want to get the flu shot. And the Third Circuit dismissed the employee's lawsuit. And they dismissed it because the Third Circuit, the court, found that the employee did not have a sincerely held religious belief. So when you're looking at Title VII, what's important to note is you as the employer should not make that determination about whether a religious belief is sincerely held, because it's so incredibly fact sensitive, and it's something that will be subject to litigation. And if you say, listen, employee, we are going to engage in that analysis at the employer level, you're just opening yourself up to a hotbed of issues. But if you get sued, okay, you can always challenge whether or not the religious belief is sincerely held in court. And that's what happened in Fallon, is they challenged it in court. And the court found that the employee's beliefs were sincerely held, but were not religious, because this employee didn't want to get the vaccine because the employee was worried about the health effects of the vaccine and disbelieved the science behind vaccines. That's what that employee said. And so the employee, the Third Circuit, there's case law now that's published in the Third Circuit, which means it's binding, that says if you disbelieve the science and that's your basis for refusing it, that's not sufficient under Title VII. So I think that is like a really, really important case, but it's something that you should, if you get sued, needs to be argued in court. It's not something you as the employer should go into with the employee. You should hang your hat on your accommodation analysis. And that's complicated, but hopefully I presented it in such a way that made sense and you're getting it. But there is good case law out here on vaccines that are going to help protect employers from making these hard calls. And Chrissy, I'm taking it that there's no questions right now because I haven't heard any come up in the chat. So I'm just going to keep going on the next slide, and we're going to talk a little bit about the interactive dialogue that's required. And again, as you have questions, please throw it in the chat, and we can have, again, a discussion this morning. And I promise I have my coffee, as I hope you all have your coffee, and are ready to sort of talk about the nuances here. Okay, interactive dialogue. If you take anything away from this presentation, you should take away that an interactive dialogue is required. So no matter what policy that you have regarding vaccines, if you're thinking about doing a mandatory vaccine policy after the Pfizer vaccine, Moderna gets full approval from the FDA, or if you're talking about strongly encouraging your employees to get the vaccine, you should know that an interactive dialogue is required for employees that don't want to do it, okay? And the interactive dialogue needs to be focused on, is there a reasonable accommodation that can be made to allow the employee to perform the essential functions of their job without compromising the health and safety of the workplace. So again, it's fact specific. So you really need to look at your workplace and determine what are the risks of an employee that's not vaccinated. And I know we've got a lot of people on the call today, and you all have your own workplaces that have their own issues. So again, fact sensitive, think about your own workplace. Now, as you're considering possible vaccine policies, I encourage you to be creative with it, because it's not an all or nothing policy. You can, if as you're looking at your workforce and you're going, let's say hypothetically that you are a large retail outlet, and it makes sense for your employees that are public facing, that interact with members of the public, you would like them to get vaccinated because their interactions with the public are high, and the risk of transmission is high, and so you want vaccines for them. But you have an office staff that has no interactions with the public, and they are working largely remotely, and it doesn't make sense for them to get vaccinated. You'd like them to, but it doesn't make sense. You can, as an employer, be creative, and you can have what we call a hybrid approach to COVID vaccine policy. So you can write out a policy that requires, certain job descriptions in sections of your employment workforce to get vaccinated because they're public facing, because they pose a larger risk, because under OSHA, the risk of those workplaces is medium or high. And you can have policy, the same policy that says, if you're in these other job categories that work for us, where you're working remotely and your risk isn't high, we encourage you to get the vaccine, but it's not mandatory. So you can have, a hybrid approach there that's specific. Now, what's the dangers with a hybrid approach? The dangers with a hybrid approach is that you risk a discrimination claim if you don't apply it objectively and uniformly across the board. So you need to make sure that if you're engaging in a hybrid approach, that you have objective reasons for requiring this certain section of employees to get the vaccine, and you have objective reasons for saying this other section is not mandatory, it's just encouraged to get the vaccine. Objective being the key word. The other good thing about a hybrid approach is if you have an employee that is in that public facing part of your organization, a higher risk part of your organization that does not want to get the vaccine because they have a medical exemption or they have a sincerely held religious belief that they don't want to get it, having a section of your workforce that is remote or is a lower risk section of your workforce gives you some leverage in the interactive dialogue process to see if maybe a transition to a different department that doesn't require the vaccine is a possible solution for the interactive dialogue. So again, be creative here. The most important thing you do is when you engage in this interactive dialogue is you look case by case. What are the circumstances that the employee is having an issue with? And is there another way that you can accommodate it that maintains the safety for the rest of your workforce, for the public, if you engage in a public facing position with your company? So again, be creative.
Hey, Megan, we do have one question.
Oh, great.
So this may be more of a medical question, so it's okay if you can't answer it completely, but maybe if you want to give your opinion. But if you, just keeping in mind that I think a lot of our audience are essential workers, essential being, manufacturers working in agriculture, food industry, things like that.
Got it.
So if you've already had a few employees that have tested positive for COVID-19, do they still need to get the vaccine? And then in addition to that, do you recommend still encouraging them to get vaccinated?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. I'm glad that came up. So, I mean, and again, I think you're right, Chrissy, that this is more of a medical question, but I think as employers, we find ourselves, just in the weeds on the recent medical dialogue that's happening right now. And from what I have read and the guidance that I've seen come out on the vaccine, if you've already had a COVID diagnosis, is that I think you're still encouraged to get vaccinated because the vaccine, again, everything's experimental. So footnote, keep tracking as this science comes out, but the vaccine should provide a longer protection. And I don't understand why, that's why I didn't go into science, but they're saying that if you've already had COVID, you should probably still get the vaccine. There's also the possibility of getting an antibodies test to determine if you have sufficient antibodies as well. So I would say stay on the medical science, and if you have an employee that's coming to you and says, I don't want to get the vaccine because I've actually had COVID, and so I already have the antibodies, so I don't need the vaccine, I would say I would treat that almost not necessarily as like a disability under the ADA, but to me that would fall under a medical exemption, which triggers the ADA. So get documentation from a healthcare provider. Don't take the employee's word for it. If they have a primary care physician that says they don't need to get the vaccine because they already have sufficient antibodies or what have you, get health provider documentation for the exemption of it, and engage in this interactive dialogue with the employee and make sure that whatever medical documentation is provided, you're comfortable with them maintaining their position in the essential workforce. So I would say treat it like you would treat a medical exemption under the ADA. Get some type of medical documentation from the employee's provider, and again, you don't need to go into the weeds on it. You need the medical provider to say they don't need the vaccine because they already have sufficient antibodies. You don't need to know anything else, but you should get that in writing and continue to follow the guidance as the vaccines are distributed and the studies come out. My understanding is they're still encouraging, even if you've had a COVID-19 diagnosis, to get the vaccine, but that may change. So keep updated. That's a great question. Thanks, Christine. Thanks for who provided that question. Okay, so the other thing you need to keep in mind too is that state law definitely plays a part here in your analysis, a large part, because under our federal system, states have what we call the general police powers to ensure the public health, safety, and welfare. So a lot of power to mandate vaccines is going to come from your individual state. Alternatively, there are states that are talking about prohibiting a mandatory vaccine policy. So definitely you need to keep up to date on the states. The only update I have for you with regard to states right now is that New York has introduced a bill to mandate the vaccine. So obviously, if you're in a state that is requiring the vaccine, then you need to follow your state requirements. Now, for those of you that have employees across multiple states, be ready for an issue, because what I'm seeing is I'm seeing a significant number of states that are saying we're going to do mandatory vaccines. And I'm seeing a significant number of states that are hubbing about not having a mandatory vaccine. And that's going to make things really hard. It's going to basically put the onus on the employer to have to shuffle through all of that. So stay up to date with the states that you're doing business in, and stay up to date on the legislation that's getting passed out. If you do business in a state that doesn't have a mandatory vaccine law and actually comes out and says we are prohibiting mandatory COVID-19 vaccines, then you as the employer, your hands are a bit tied there, and you should definitely look at any policies you've put in place for the vaccine and say, I would say you need to continue to encourage employees to get it, but you can't make it mandatory. So as with much of COVID, be prepared for a patchwork of requirements to come out, and we may get stronger federal guidance in the coming months, but right now we don't have it. So be prepared for state laws to contradict one another and to change. And once the vaccine, again, we're in this really weird time period where we've got an experimental vaccine that's out that is likely going to get final approval in the coming months. So be prepared for the analysis to change once the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine gets full FDA approval. That could also change the analysis as well. So unfortunately, no good news on that front. But your state law is going to be very, very important. And also, if your business is in a major metropolitan city like New York, like Philadelphia, they have their own local ordinances that may also impact the COVID-19 vaccine. Again, there's nothing to report now, but similar to the PPE regulations that have come out, and how we have basically gone from March to the current time in terms of figuring out reopening guidance, best workplace practices, you're going to need to look at your specific cities, as well, if you're in one of those major metropolitan areas.
Megan, we have another question.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Okay, so this one is in terms of recruiting. So, whether or not your office is requiring a vaccine. I know we've talked about whether or not that we can, mandate that throughout the presentation, but in the spirit of assuming that your office requires a vaccine, are you allowed to ask a candidate if they've been vaccinated, or is that a HIPAA violation?
So actually what's great is the EEOC has come out and said proof of vaccination is not medical test. It's not a medical test. It's not a HIPAA violation. So you can, say, and I would say, like, also not just have you been vaccinated, but please, you're going to need to provide proof of your vaccine. That's a condition to starting your employment, is providing proof that you've received the vaccine. And that's fine. You can't ask any questions. So, like, if you are recruiting and you say you need to provide proof that you've gotten the COVID-19 vaccine to start, and the perspective goes, well, I didn't get the COVID-19 vaccine, then you have to be careful about what you're asking, because you can't ask questions about medical history. So you can't say, well, do you have a medical condition? Is that why you didn't get it? You can't go into family medical history. So you have to be careful. If you do, you need to have basically job-related pre-screen questions. So that can be kind of hard to do. So it's a slippery slope. Is sort of what I'm saying. If you have someone who says, listen, I can't get the vaccine, so I'm not going to be able to provide you proof of that, then I would say make a note on it, talk to HR and go through just a dialogue, because there's a you may need to see if the interactive dialogue is required at that point, even though the person hasn't been hired yet. If there's another job at the facility or your workforce they could do where they're not required to be vaccinated. So it's a slippery slope. So just make a note of it, talk to HR, and make sure that you get back to the candidate with a game plan. Whether you can't have them, they don't have any other qualifications to be considered for another position at your company, but there may be an obligation there to hop into the interactive dialogue on that. So recruitment is definitely difficult, for sure, if you're requiring proof of the vaccine. So if you're an essential worker and you're working in healthcare in particular, and you need the vaccine, I would treat it like you would treat any other recruitment with any other vaccine requirement that you have, with like flu shot vaccines or things like that. Treat it the same. Now, and again, it's a little difficult because we're in this experimental phase with this particular vaccine too. So just have that footnote in your mind that this is still an experimental vaccine. So you can't there needs to be a mechanism for opt-out with it. So it's hard to make a hard and fast rule that you absolutely need proof of the vaccine, because under the Emergency Use Act, you need to have an opt-out provision. So this is a tricky situation. It's absolutely a tricky situation. So I would say you can ask about it if you have someone that doesn't get it and they say, I can't get it, or I didn't get it, I won't get it because it goes against my religious beliefs. You know, say, okay, you know, let's talk with HR and make sure you handle it delicately and just be careful. That would be my advice. Whew, great questions. Okay, practical concerns. Okay, so all of these other things that you need to keep in your mind. You know, listen, if you have a unionized workforce, you certainly have to be careful about how you implement a mandatory vaccine policy. Make sure you look at your collective bargaining agreement and your obligations under your union contract to either whether it addresses mandatory vaccines or other health screenings, or if implementation of such a policy would require union consent and would need to be bargained for. So just watch out on that. You also have to be careful here with age discrimination. And I say that because, you know, we've been talking about COVID for a while, and we've been talking about that older individuals are more susceptible to COVID. And there may be an inclination as an employer to treat older workers differently, and that would be a violation of the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. So you need to be very careful, not to make decisions about mandatory vaccine policies based on age, even though it might be coming from a very grounded reason based in science that they're more susceptible. You can't do that. That's why if you are looking at making a mandatory vaccine policy, you have to look at the job characteristics and base it on objective job characteristics. You can't base it on the age of the employee. So just know that that's a trap. So don't do that. You have to be careful about workers' compensation too. So there is a concern that if you mandate a vaccine and an employee has an adverse reaction to the vaccine, that would trigger liability for workers' comp and potentially lawsuits. Alternatively, if you don't require a vaccine, you're not encouraging people to get the vaccine, and then you've got a COVID-19 case at your workforce and it spreads, you've got a workers' compensation issue. So, I mean, really, in terms of liability, I'm putting workers' comp out there because it's something that you need to be thinking about, but you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. I would say that when you're looking at the total risk, the risk of not having any vaccine policy, even if it's encouraging your vaccine, okay? So if you don't have any policy on the books and you've got a COVID-19 infection and it spreads, that would be a much higher risk from a liability standpoint than an isolated incident of one employee having an adverse reaction to a vaccine. So you just need to really be careful to draft your policy, keep that in mind. But there's liability on both sides there. And then you have this idea of workplace morale. And only you know your workplace, the sentiments that are going around in your workplace. You know, is morale going to be increased if you have a policy that encourages vaccines, that talks about the benefits of vaccines? Is that going to help your workplace morale for people to know that the majority of people they're working around have the vaccine? Are people going to refuse to go to work if the employer doesn't have a vaccine policy? If people don't feel safe because the employer is not encouraging their employees to get the vaccine, could that be grounds to refuse to go to work? Possibly. So definitely keep a pulse, you know, on your workplace and what the feelings are of your workers as you're looking at which policy to implement. So what are best practices as you're going into figuring out your COVID-19 vaccine policy? And everybody's already doing this because you're on this call. You need to start now. You need to be having this dialogue now. It's very, very important that you have this dialogue, and it should be a continual dialogue with the leadership in your office about what policy makes sense for you and how you're going to implement it. To fail to address it would be the worst thing you can do right now. So you definitely need to be actively thinking about it. Cast a wide net. Okay, so you need to be thinking, or like I say, be creative. Do a whole review of your workforce. Which employees would you absolutely want to get vaccinated because they're essential workers, and they're in the workplace, they're interacting, they're public facing. Which section of your workforce are you less concerned about, maybe because they're remote? What are the things, what if there's, like we're seeing now, what if there's a limited availability of the COVID-19 vaccine, and it's hard to get, which is what's happening now. There's phases and implementation. Each state's different. We have a lack of federal guidance. How can you craft your policy to sort of address all of those things, and really think, don't just think, yes, we want the vaccine, no, we don't. Think, cast a wide net on your issues, on your workforce, and really evaluate the different scenarios that you have, and look at it as things change, okay? Because this will be a topic, I'm sure I will be giving this same presentation a few months from now, because this is a topic that's going to be with us for a long time, for the remainder of 2021. It's not a topic that's going away. It's a topic that's going to continue to change as we have more science, as we have final FDA approvals of these vaccines, as we have wider access to these vaccines. So when you decide what policies to implement, you need to be specific with them, okay? So don't be wishy-washy. Make sure that you address, like, this is who is encouraged to get it, because again, we can't really do the mandatory vaccine policy right now with the EUA in place. This is if you have an exemption, here's what you should do to start the interactive dialogue. Here's what we need to see for proof of vaccination. There's alternative measures that could be put in place if you cannot receive the vaccine. I mean, really draft it out and be specific. As with all policies, okay, but in particular with the vaccine policy, communicate openly. Open communication is so important with your employees, especially with something like this, because everyone is thinking about it, and it's a huge development, in our workforce. So you've got to communicate openly about it. Make sure you're communicating openly with your leadership. Make sure you're communicating openly with your employees. When you have the policy and you're ready to roll it out, make sure that you provide a place for your employees to answer questions with you about it, and to have a dialogue with your employees about the policy itself. And absolutely, you've got to train your management level employees on this policy, okay, when you roll it out. Make sure your management level employees understand the specific nuances of the policy, what to do if there's an objection, who to go to in HR, and because your management level employees are really going to be the ones that are going to take a lot of the initial questions and issues with these policies. So make sure that they know what they need to do to properly implement it. And then you should always be considering alternative measures, okay? And I've seen this question come up a lot already, which is, well, if we have a vaccinated workforce, do we still need PPE? Do we still need masks? Do we still need the increased sanitation? And the answer right now in the current state of the world and where we're in is yes, you still need to have those alternative measures, especially as we're I imagine you're going to see more employees opting out of a vaccine while it's in its experimental stage. 9 months from now, hopefully after the vaccine has final FDA approval, people have more confidence in it. You're going to have less opt-outs, but you still need to have PPE in place. You should also, again, continuing to think about remote working. You need to think about rearranging the workspace itself to provide for social distancing. You need to continue to think about sanitation policies. All of those things should still be at the forefront. The vaccine policy does not take the place of any of those alternative measures. It merely adds something more for you to deal with, unfortunately. And really, you've got to stick to the law. And I mean, that can be hard right now because we do have flux happening with this new area. But again, if you leave with anything from this presentation, know that religious exemptions, medical exemptions, those are the two things that can get a person out of getting the vaccine. If you have an employee that presents one of those two issues, your response needs to be the interactive dialogue, right? And then you need to go through the interactive dialogue. It is much easier to refuse an accommodation for someone with a sincerely held religious belief because the standard is not as high as a medical exemption. If you have someone with a medical exemption, it's going to be much harder to say no to a reasonable accommodation for that, okay? So just know you've got two bases, religious, medical. Both of them lead to the same place, which is the interactive dialogue. And once you get through the interactive dialogue, you need to make a call on hardship to the employer, okay? Now, with that, we've got a few minutes left. And I don't know, Christy, if there's any other questions that are going to come into the chat, but we can chat a little bit about issues people are seeing.
So we do have one question, and Megan, if it's okay with you, I can probably take this one. So the question is, who is paying for the vaccine, and what if employees don't have health coverage? So at this current time, it is federally mandated that the carriers must cover the cost of the vaccine. So regardless of what program you're in, so whether you're fully insured, you're level funded, you're self-funded, because that's a federal mandate, the insurance carriers are required to cover the cost of that. So there should be no cost out of pocket for the employee. If an employee does not have health coverage, so if you have part-time employees that are not on your group health plan, or they just don't have coverage in general, the states have funds available to them to cover employees that don't have health coverage, for that to go through their specific insurance carrier. So what will happen is the employee can go have their vaccine. The provider that gives the vaccine to the employee will submit for reimbursement to the state to be reimbursed for that cost. So regardless of the situation, everybody should be covered and should not have to pay out of pocket to be able to get that vaccine when necessary. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. I guess I do have a question now that we're discussing the fact that, we can't mandate this just yet. Until we have that final approval from the FDA. But if you are, and I'm going to use my office as an example, and this hasn't been talked about in my office at all, but just because of our situation, we are 100% remote. However, we do allow our employees to go into the office with precautions. We have our measures in place on a voluntary basis. So if they feel they need to go into the office for whatever reason, they can do so. Can you, because that's a voluntary basis, can you require an employee to be vaccinated to come into the office if you're reasonably accommodating them to be able to work from home, but they're choosing to come into the office? Can you put that into place now, or do you still have to wait until that's approved by the FDA?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at that is I would say I don't see an issue with that because it's voluntary to come into the office. So if they don't want to get vaccinated, then the reasonable accommodation for them is to work remotely. There's nothing that's happening in the office that prohibits them from doing their job remotely. And that makes sense to me, just from a basic reasonable accommodation analysis. Now, it'd be different if they weren't able to perform essential functions of their job at home and they needed to come in the office to be able to perform those jobs. Then that's certainly a different analysis, but it doesn't sound like that's the case here. So I think requiring a vaccine before you come into the office, that makes sense. My only hiccup on that would be right now with the phase and tiered approach for distributing the vaccine, it just might not be possible for someone in that tier to get the vaccine if they're in a remote work environment, they're not an essential worker, they're not healthcare, they're not education, they would be in a later phase. So I would say that, sure, I'm not seeing any issue with requiring that vaccine, but just knowing that they might not have access to it for a little bit. That would be my one hiccup on it.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay, well, it doesn't look like we have any other additional questions. So I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Megan, thank you so much for that presentation. Very informative. I can say that I learned quite a few things from sitting through that. So, we're very excited to see how things progress, as we learn more and things change over the next few months. But I see here you have up your email and your contact information. So if anybody has any additional questions, I think Megan's thrown out her information so that you can contact her directly. You can also email me. Obviously, you're getting my emails from our registrations. So if you want to shoot me an email, I can certainly share that with Megan as well. So with that being said, thank you so much, Megan, again, for joining us today. And thank you to everybody for joining us on this webinar. And we look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me, Chrissy. Good luck, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Megan. Have a good one.
You too.